In the mist-shrouded valleys of Wales, where ancient stones mark forgotten battlefields, and Celtic bards once sang of heroes who defied the darkness, there stands a question that has haunted the Western imagination for over 1,500 years. Was there ever a man named Arthur? Not the Arthur of gleaming Camelot, with his pristine round table and his noble knights in shining armor. Not the Arthur of Hollywood films, with his magical sword and his wizard Merlin performing impossible feats, but a real man, a warrior, a leader who might have stood against the Saxon tide in the chaos that followed Rome's abandonment of Britain. This is not a simple question to answer, for Arthur exists in that twilight realm where history and legend intertwine so completely that separating them is like trying to unweave a tapestry that has been rewoven by countless hands across countless generations. Every thread we pull reveals another layer, another story, another transformation of a tale that refuses to be pinned down. The Arthur we think we know, the once and future king, the perfect Christian monarch, the tragic hero of courtly romance, is largely a medieval creation, a literary figure who grew in power and complexity with each generation of storytellers. But beneath these layers of legend, beneath the accumulated centuries of myth-making, there may lie something far more interesting: the ghost of a real historical moment, a time when Britain stood at a crossroads between the ancient world and the medieval, between Celtic tradition and Saxon invasion, between the fading light of Rome and the uncertain dawn of what would become England. To understand Arthur, we must first understand the world that created the need for such a figure. In the year 410 CE, after nearly 400 years of occupation, Rome abandoned Britain. The legions withdrew, the administrators departed, and a province that had been part of the greatest empire the world had ever known was left to fend for itself. This was not a gentle transition. Roman Britain had been a sophisticated civilization, with thriving cities, elaborate villas, complex trade networks, and a Romano-British elite that had adopted Latin culture while maintaining their Celtic roots. But this civilization was utterly dependent on Roman military protection and economic systems. When Rome withdrew, the collapse was swift and catastrophic. The historical sources for this period are frustratingly sparse. We have Gildas, a British monk writing in the 540s, whose De Excidio Britanniae, on the ruin of Britain, provides our earliest account of the Saxon invasions. But Gildas was not writing history as we understand it. He was writing a moral sermon, a Jeremiah against the sins of his contemporaries, and his account is colored by his religious purpose. According to Gildas, the British initially tried to govern themselves, but they faced attacks from the Picts and Scots in the north. Desperate for military aid, they made a fateful decision that would echo through the centuries. They invited Saxon mercenaries, German warriors from across the North Sea, to help defend their lands. This was not an unusual arrangement. Rome itself had long employed barbarian foederati, allied troops who were granted land in exchange for military service. But in post-Roman Britain, this policy proved catastrophic. The Saxon mercenaries, led by figures Gildas calls Hengist and Horsa, soon turned on their British employers. They brought over their kinsmen, seized more territory, and began what amounted to the conquest of eastern Britain. The archaeological evidence supports this picture of catastrophic change. Roman towns were abandoned, villa complexes fell into ruin, and the sophisticated pottery, coins, and other markers of Roman civilization simply disappear from the archaeological record. This is what historians call the dark earth phenomenon, literally the dark soil that accumulated over the ruins of Roman buildings as they decayed.
But the Britons did not simply vanish. In the western regions, Wales, Cornwall, and the north, Romano-British culture persisted and evolved. These were the areas where Celtic languages survived, where traditional tribal structures reasserted themselves, and where, according to later legend, Arthur would make his stand. The linguistic evidence is particularly revealing. While Anglo-Saxon gradually became the dominant language of what would become England, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton preserved much older British Celtic traditions. In these languages, we find the earliest references to Arthur, though even these are tantalizingly brief and often ambiguous. The Annales Cambriae, Welsh Annals, record two crucial entries. For the year 516, they note, "The Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors." For 537, "The Battle of Camlann, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell." These bare entries, written centuries after the supposed events, are among our earliest historical references to Arthur. But they raise more questions than they answer. Who was this Arthur? Was he a king, a war leader, a legendary figure already being conflated with real historical events? And what can we make of a battle that supposedly lasted 3 days and nights? The Historia Brittonum, traditionally attributed to Nennius and written around 830, provides more detail but is equally problematic. It describes Arthur not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, a war leader who fought alongside the kings of the Britons in 12 great battles against the Saxons. The culminating victory comes at Badon Hill, where Arthur is said to have single-handedly killed 960 enemies. This is clearly not sober historical reporting. By the time Nennius was writing, Arthur had already begun his transformation from possible historical figure to legendary hero. But buried within these obviously inflated accounts may be genuine historical memories, the memory of British resistance, of crucial battles, of a time when the Saxon advance was halted. Modern historians have debated endlessly about the historical Arthur. Some, like the archaeologist Leslie Alcock, have argued that the evidence, while thin, does support the existence of a British war leader, active in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Others, like the historian David Dumville, have argued that Arthur is entirely legendary, a figure who grew out of folklore and was retrospectively placed into history. The truth may lie somewhere between these positions. What seems clear is that there was indeed a period of British resistance to Saxon expansion, centered roughly on the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Archaeological evidence from hill forts across western Britain shows signs of reoccupation and fortification during this period. Something was happening, some kind of organized resistance, some kind of military revival. Whether this resistance was led by a figure named Arthur, or whether Arthur is a later legendary crystallization of various resistance leaders, may be impossible to determine. But the historical context, the desperate struggle of Romano-British civilization against Saxon expansion, provides the essential background for understanding why the Arthur legend took the form it did. The earliest echoes, Arthur in Welsh tradition. Before Arthur became the perfect Christian king of medieval romance, before he ruled from Camelot and commanded the Round Table, he existed in a very different form in the oral traditions and early literature of Wales. This Welsh Arthur is a figure both more and less than his later incarnations, more rooted in ancient Celtic mythology, less constrained by Christian morality and chivalric idealism. Our earliest glimpse of this Welsh Arthur comes from the Eugoddna, a collection of elegies attributed to the 6th century poet Aneurin. The poem commemorates British warriors who died fighting the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Catterick, modern Cattic. In praising one fallen hero, the poet says, "He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur." This tantalizing reference, if authentic, would make it our earliest mention of Arthur in literature. But it tells us something crucial. By the time this poem was composed, Arthur was already famous enough that his name could be used as the ultimate standard of warrior prowess. The implication is that everyone knew who Arthur was and what he represented. The Welsh Arthur emerges more fully in later texts like the Culhwch and Olwen, one of the stories included in the collection known as the Mabinogion. This tale, probably composed in the 11th century, but preserving much older material, presents Arthur as a larger-than-life figure who commands not just human warriors, but magical helpers and supernatural forces. In Culhwch and Olwen, Arthur is asked to help the young hero Culhwch win the hand of Olwen, daughter of the giant Ysbaddaden. The giant sets what seem like impossible tasks, including hunting the great boar Torctruith across Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall. Arthur assembles a band of heroes with fantastical abilities, men who can hear an ant walking 50 miles away, who can stand on a mountain and make it seem like a plain, who can drain entire lakes at a single drink. This is Arthur as Celtic mythological hero, closer to the Irish Finn mac Cool or the Welsh Math Matonwe than to the historical Wars-Eater glimpsed in the chronicles. He possesses magical weapons, his ship Prydwen, his shield Wynebgwrth Utcher, his sword Caled Vulch, later Excalibur, his spear Rhongomyniad. He can transform into animal form. He leads the wild hunt. He journeys to the other world. The Black Book of Carmarthen and other early Welsh manuscripts preserve fragments of poems that hint at this mythological Arthur. In one, Arthur speaks of his adventures, mentioning battles with monsters, journeys to mysterious islands, and encounters with supernatural beings. In another, he engages in a dialogue with the gatekeeper of a fortress, boasting of his warriors and their deeds.
What emerges from these early Welsh sources is an Arthur who straddles the boundary between the human and divine worlds. He is both a war leader who fights historical battles against the Saxons and a mythological figure who descends into the underworld, fights giants and monsters, and commands magical forces. This duality is crucial to understanding Arthur's later development. The historical core, the memory of British resistance to Saxon conquest, became entangled with much older Celtic mythological patterns. Arthur absorbed characteristics of earlier mythological figures: the divine king who ensures the fertility of the land, the hero who journeys to the other world, the leader who will return in the hour of greatest need. The Welsh tradition also preserves elements that would later be transformed or suppressed in medieval romance. The Welsh Arthur is not particularly Christian. Indeed, some of the early poems hint at tension between Arthur and the Church. He is not bound by chivalric codes of behavior. He can be cunning,
ruthless, even cruel when necessary. His court is not the refined civilization of Camelot, but a warrior hall where strength matters more than courtesy. Perhaps most significantly, the Welsh tradition preserves the tragic dimension of Arthur's story. The Battle of Camlann, in which Arthur and Medrawd, later Mordred, both die, is remembered as one of the 3 futile battles of the island of Britain. The implication is that this battle was not just a military defeat, but a catastrophe for British civilization, the moment when the dream of resistance died. The Welsh also preserved traditions about Arthur's final fate that differ dramatically from later Romance versions. In Welsh tradition, Arthur does not die, but is carried away to Avalon to await his return. But this return is not the triumphant second coming of medieval romance. It is tied to ancient Celtic beliefs about the sovereignty of the land, the idea that the rightful king must return to restore fertility and justice. This Welsh Arthur provides the crucial link between any possible historical figure and the literary creation that would captivate medieval Europe. He shows us how historical memory can become mythologized, how a war leader can become a god king, how the desperate hopes of a conquered people can crystallize into enduring legend. But the Welsh Arthur remained largely confined to Celtic-speaking areas. For Arthur to become a truly European figure, he needed a translator, a cultural broker who could take these Welsh traditions and present them to the wider medieval world. That broker would be Geoffrey of Monmouth, whose history of the kings of Britain would transform Arthur from Celtic hero to international legend. The Great Transformation, Geoffrey of Monmouth's revolutionary vision. In or around 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth completed a work that would change the course of European literature and reshape the medieval understanding of British history. His Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, was ostensibly a chronicle, a serious historical work that traced the story of Britain from its founding by the Trojan prince Brutus to the death of the last British king Cadwallader in 689 CE. But Geoffrey's history was something far more radical and creative than its title suggests. It was a work of brilliant historical fiction, a reimagining of British history that gave the island a past to rival that of Rome itself. And at the center of this reimagined history stood Arthur, transformed from a shadowy Welsh hero to the greatest king Britain had ever known. Geoffrey was not working in a vacuum. He was writing at a crucial moment in medieval history, when the Norman conquest had created a new Anglo-Norman elite that needed to understand and justify its rule over both the Anglo-Saxon English and the Celtic Welsh. The Normans had conquered England in 1066, but they found themselves ruling over a land with a complex and fractured history, where different peoples claimed different legitimacies. Geoffrey's genius was to provide a unifying narrative that could satisfy multiple audiences. For the Norman elite, he created a British past that was glorious enough to be worth ruling. For the Welsh, he elevated their traditions to the level of classical history. For everyone, he created a vision of Arthur that transcended tribal boundaries and spoke to universal ideals of kingship and heroism. Geoffrey claimed to be translating from a very ancient book written in the British language that had been given to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. No such book has ever been found, and most modern scholars believe Geoffrey invented this source to give his work historical credibility. In reality, Geoffrey was drawing on a variety of sources: early Welsh chronicles, oral traditions, classical historians like Livy and Virgil, biblical narratives, and his own considerable imagination.
In Geoffrey's version, Arthur becomes a figure of European significance, born through the magic of Merlin, who disguises Arthur's father Uther Pendragon to sleep with Igraine, Duchess of Cornwall. Arthur pulls the sword from the stone to prove his rightful kingship. But Geoffrey's Arthur is not content to rule just Britain. He conquers Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, and Gaul, establishing an empire that rivals Rome itself. Geoffrey provides Arthur with a detailed biography that follows the pattern of classical heroes. There is the miraculous birth, the hidden childhood, the revelation of true identity, the gathering of companions, the great conquests, the golden age of peace and prosperity, and finally, the tragic fall brought about by betrayal and civil war. The court, Geoffrey describes, is magnificent beyond anything in earlier Welsh tradition. Arthur holds court at Caerleon on Usk, where he is served by nobles from across his empire. Geoffrey describes elaborate ceremonies, rich feasts, tournaments, and games. This is the first glimpse of what would later become Camelot, a court that represents the highest ideals of medieval civilization.
Geoffrey also gives us the first developed version of many elements that would become central to Arthurian legend. Merlin appears as Arthur's advisor and guide, though Geoffrey's Merlin is primarily a prophet and magician rather than the wise counselor of later romance. Guinevere appears as Arthur's queen, though her adultery with Mordred, not yet Lancelot, leads directly to the kingdom's downfall. The sword Excalibur makes its first appearance, though Geoffrey calls it Caliburnus and makes it a gift from the island of Avalon rather than the sword from the stone. The round table is not mentioned. That innovation would come later, but Geoffrey does describe the egalitarian nature of Arthur's court, where merit matters more than birth. Perhaps most importantly, Geoffrey provides Arthur with a historical context that makes his achievements believable. Arthur appears at a moment when Britain is threatened by Saxon invasion, and his victories are presented as the salvation of British civilization. The Battle of Badon becomes a decisive victory that secures 15 years of peace. Arthur's continental conquests are presented as the natural extension of his success in defending Britain. But Geoffrey does not shy away from the tragic dimensions of the Arthur story. The final chapters of Arthur's reign are dominated by the rebellion of Mordred, Arthur's nephew, later transformed into his illegitimate son. While Arthur is campaigning in Gaul, Mordred seizes the throne and marries Guinevere. Arthur returns to face his nephew in the final battle at Camlann, where both are mortally wounded. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's death is deliberately ambiguous. Arthur is carried away to the Isle of Avalon to have his wounds healed, but Geoffrey does not say whether he dies or recovers. This ambiguity would prove crucial to later developments of the legend, providing the foundation for the belief in Arthur's eventual return. The impact of Geoffrey's history was immediate and enormous. Within 50 years, it had been translated into numerous European languages. Chroniclers treated it as authentic history. Poets mined it for stories, and royal courts across Europe claimed descent from Geoffrey's British kings. But Geoffrey's work also faced criticism almost immediately. Other historians, particularly William of Newburgh, attacked it as fiction masquerading as history. William famously wrote that Geoffrey had made up lying fables about Arthur and lied saucily and shamelessly. Modern scholars generally agree with William of Newburgh's assessment. Geoffrey's history is not reliable as historical fact. But its importance lies in its creative achievement. Geoffrey took the fragmentary Welsh traditions about Arthur and transformed them into a coherent, compelling narrative that could speak to the aspirations and anxieties of 12th century Europe. Geoffrey created the template that all later Arthurian literature would follow. He established Arthur as a figure of European importance, gave him a detailed biography, surrounded him with memorable characters, and set his story in a context that spoke to medieval ideals of kingship and chivalry. But Geoffrey's Arthur was still essentially a warrior king, a conqueror whose greatness lay in his military achievements. It would take the French Romance writers to transform him into something even more influential, the perfect embodiment of chivalric idealism, the king who ruled not through conquest but through moral authority, the center of a court where love and honor mattered more than power and warfare. The flowering of romance, Arthur in the court of love. The transformation of Arthur from Geoffrey of Monmouth's warrior king into the central figure of medieval romance represents one of the most significant developments in European literature. This transformation took place primarily in 12th century France, where a new literary culture was emerging around the courts of great nobles. These courts, particularly that of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne, became centers of a revolutionary new form of literature that would reshape the entire Arthurian tradition. The French Romance writers inherited Geoffrey's basic narrative framework, but they were interested in very different themes. Where Geoffrey had focused on conquest and political power, the Romance writers were fascinated by questions of love, honor, and personal identity. They took Arthur's court and transformed it into an idealized society where these new values could be explored and celebrated. The key figure in this transformation was Chrétien de Troyes, active in the 1160s and 1170s. Chrétien wrote 5 Arthurian romances that established the basic patterns that would dominate the tradition for centuries to come. His innovations were so fundamental that virtually every subsequent Arthurian work can be traced back to his influence. Chrétien's first innovation was to shift focus away from Arthur himself. In Geoffrey's history, Arthur is the undisputed protagonist, the figure around whom all events revolve. But in Chrétien's romances, Arthur becomes what scholars call a roi fainéant, a do-nothing king who provides a stable center around which other characters can pursue their adventures. This change was crucial because it allowed the Romance writers to explore themes that couldn't be developed with Arthur as the central figure. Arthur, as the perfect king, couldn't undergo the kind of moral development that makes for compelling narrative. But his knights could struggle with questions of identity, could fail and be redeemed, could grow and change through their adventures. Chrétien's Eric and Enid establishes the basic pattern of Arthurian romance. A knight proves himself through adventures, wins the love of a lady, but then must undergo further trials to prove himself worthy of that love. His Iwain the Knight of the Lion explores the tension between chivalric duty and married love, while Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, introduces the most famous love story in medieval literature. It was Chrétien who created Lancelot and made him the greatest of Arthur's knights. More importantly, it was Chrétien who made Lancelot the lover of Arthur's queen, Guinevere. This innovation transformed the entire dynamic of Arthurian romance, introducing a fundamental contradiction that would drive countless subsequent stories. Lancelot represents the perfect knight, brave, courteous, devoted to his lady, but his love for Guinevere is adulterous, a betrayal of his king and friend. This contradiction cannot be resolved within the logic of romance, and it provides the tragic tension that would eventually destroy Arthur's kingdom.
Chrétien also introduced the Grail into Arthurian literature, though his Perceval, the story of the Grail, was left unfinished at his death. Chrétien's Grail is not yet the cup that caught Christ's blood. It is simply a mysterious vessel that appears at a strange feast attended by the young knight Perceval. But Chrétien's introduction of this mystical element opened up new possibilities for Arthurian literature, pointing toward the spiritual quests that would become central to later developments. The French Romance writers also gave us the Round Table, though its origins are disputed. Some scholars trace it back to Celtic traditions of egalitarian feasting, while others see it as a French innovation designed to solve the problem of precedence in a hierarchical society. Whatever its origins, the Round Table became the perfect symbol of Arthurian idealism, a fellowship where worth mattered more than birth, where the greatest knights in the world could sit as equals. The physical setting of Arthurian romance was also transformed by the French writers. Geoffrey's Arthur had held court at Caerleon on Usk, a real place with historical associations. But the Romance writers moved the court to Camelot, a name that appears to be derived from Camlann, the site of Arthur's last battle. This choice is symbolically perfect. Arthur's court is built on the site of his future destruction, a reminder that even the greatest achievements contain the seeds of their own downfall. Camelot, as described by the Romance writers, is less a place than an ideal. It represents perfect governance, perfect justice, perfect courtesy. It is a society where the strong protect the weak, where love inspires noble deeds, where adventure always leads to moral improvement. But it is also fragile, constantly threatened by forces both external and internal. The French Romance writers developed an elaborate code of chivalry that governed behavior in this idealized society. Knights were expected to be brave in battle, courteous to all, especially women, generous to the poor, faithful to their lord, and devoted to the church. They were to seek adventure not for personal gain, but to prove their worth and to protect the innocent. This chivalric code represented a profound departure from earlier warrior cultures. The heroes of Germanic epic like Beowulf or the warriors of the Iliad fought for glory, treasure, and the survival of their people. But the knights of Arthurian romance fought for more abstract ideals: honor, love, spiritual perfection. The French Romance writers also developed the concept of courtly love, the idea that a knight's devotion to a lady, usually married and therefore unattainable, could inspire him to great deeds and moral improvement. This concept transformed the role of women in chivalric literature, making them not just prizes to be won, but sources of moral authority and inspiration. But the Romance writers were too sophisticated to present this idealized society without acknowledging its contradictions and limitations. The very perfection of Arthur's court makes it vulnerable to corruption. The absolute devotion expected of knights can lead to tragic conflicts of loyalty. The code of courtly love leads inevitably to adultery and betrayal. These contradictions come to a head in the greatest of all Arthurian romances, the Lancelot Grail cycle, also known as the Vulgate cycle, composed in early 13th century France. This massive work, running to thousands of pages in modern editions, attempts to tell the complete story of Arthur's kingdom from its foundations to its destruction.
The Vulgate cycle introduces the Christianized version of the Grail, now explicitly identified as the cup used at the Last Supper and to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion. The Grail quest becomes a spiritual journey that tests not just the physical courage of Arthur's knights, but their moral and spiritual purity. Only 3 knights, Galahad, Perceval, and Bors, are pure enough to achieve the Grail. Significantly, Lancelot, the greatest knight in terms of martial prowess, fails in the Grail quest because of his adulterous love for Guinevere. The message is clear. Earthly love, however noble, cannot compete with spiritual devotion. The Vulgate cycle also develops the full tragic trajectory of Arthur's kingdom. The discovery of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair destroys the fellowship of the Round Table. Arthur is forced to condemn his queen to death, Lancelot rescues her, and the knights divide into opposing camps. In the end, Arthur and Mordred destroy each other at Camlann, and the Golden Age comes to an end. This French Romance tradition represents the full flowering of medieval Arthurian literature. It created the version of Arthur's story that would dominate European culture for centuries. The tale of the perfect kingdom destroyed by the very ideals that made it great. It established the major characters, developed the central themes, and created the narrative patterns that would influence literature down to the present day. But this tradition also moved Arthur far from any possible historical origins. The Arthur of French romance is entirely a literary creation, a figure designed to embody medieval ideals rather than represent historical reality. To complete our understanding of Arthur's medieval transformation, we need to examine how this French tradition was received and adapted in England, particularly in the work of Thomas Malory, who created the definitive English version of the Arthurian legend. The English synthesis, Malory's Morte d'Arthur. By the late 15th century, Arthurian literature had become a vast, sprawling, and often contradictory tradition. French romances, German epics, Italian poems, and English chronicles had created hundreds of stories about Arthur and his knights, often conflicting with each other in fundamental ways. Different versions gave different accounts of Arthur's birth, different lists of his knights, different explanations for his downfall.
It was into this chaotic literary landscape that Thomas Malory stepped with his Le Morte d'Arthur, completed sometime around 1470 and first printed by William Caxton in 1485. Malory's achievement was to take this mass of disparate material and forge it into a single coherent narrative that would become the definitive English version of the Arthurian legend. Malory himself remains a mysterious figure. The most likely candidate is Sir Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel in Warwickshire, a knight who spent much of his later life in prison for various crimes, including robbery, extortion, and rape. If this identification is correct, then the man who created the most influential version of the chivalric ideal was himself a violent criminal who embodied everything that chivalry was supposed to oppose. This irony becomes even more striking when we consider that Malory was writing during the Wars of the Roses, a period when English chivalry had largely collapsed into factional violence, and when the ideals represented by Arthur's Round Table seemed like impossible dreams. Malory's work can be read as a nostalgic lament for a golden age that never existed, written by a man who had witnessed the failure of the chivalric ideal in his own time. Malory drew primarily on French sources, particularly the Vulgate cycle, but he transformed these sources in significant ways.
Where the French romances had been concerned with courtly love and spiritual questing, Malory focused more on fellowship, loyalty, and the bonds between men. His knights are less courtly lovers than brothers in arms, bound together by their devotion to Arthur and to each other. Malory's Arthur is also different from his French predecessors. Where the Romance writers had made Arthur a distant, almost passive figure, Malory's Arthur is more active and more human. He makes mistakes, he struggles with difficult decisions, he grieves for his fallen knights. This Arthur is recognizably a medieval king, dealing with the practical problems of governance while trying to maintain the ideals that give his reign meaning. Perhaps most significantly, Malory emphasizes the tragic dimension of the Arthurian story. His title, Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, signals from the beginning that this is not a story of triumph, but of tragic failure. Malory structures his work around a series of escalating disasters that ultimately destroy everything Arthur has built. The tragedy begins with Arthur's unknowing incest with his half-sister Morgause, which produces Mordred, the agent of Arthur's destruction. It continues with the Grail quest, which fragments the Round Table as knights depart on individual spiritual journeys. It reaches its climax with the discovery of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, which destroys the trust and loyalty that held Arthur's court together. Malory's account of the final destruction is one of the most powerful passages in English literature. The Round Table is broken, the knights are scattered or dead, and Arthur faces his illegitimate son Mordred in single combat at Camlann. Both are mortally wounded, and Arthur is carried away to Avalon by mysterious queens, his fate uncertain. But Malory does not end with despair. In his famous conclusion, he suggests that Arthur may return when Britain has need of him again. Yet some men say in many parts of England that King Arthur is not dead, but had by the will of our Lord Jesu into another place. And men say that he shall come again, and he shall win the Holy Cross. This hope for Arthur's return became central to English national identity. Unlike other legendary heroes who die definitively, Arthur remains perpetually available, ready to return in the hour of greatest need. This belief in the once and future king would resurface throughout English history, most notably during World War II, when Winston Churchill explicitly compared Britain's struggle against Nazi Germany to Arthur's battles against the Saxons. Malory's work succeeded because it captured something essential about the Arthurian legend, its ability to embody both the highest human aspirations and the tragic recognition that these aspirations can never be fully realized. The Round Table represents perfect fellowship, but it is destroyed by the very human weaknesses of its members. Arthur represents perfect kingship, but he cannot prevent the forces that tear his kingdom apart. Caxton's printing of Malory's work in 1485 was perfectly timed. It appeared just as the Tudor dynasty was establishing itself after victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, claimed descent from Arthur through his Welsh ancestry, and he named his eldest son Arthur to emphasize this connection. Though Prince Arthur died young, the Tudors continued to use Arthurian symbolism to legitimize their rule. The printed version of Malory's work also ensured its wide circulation. Unlike the manuscript romances that had been confined to aristocratic courts, Le Mort d'Arthur could be read by anyone who could afford a book. It became, in effect, the standard version of the Arthurian story for English-speaking readers.
But Malory's work also marked the end of the medieval Arthurian tradition. After Malory, Arthur would be repeatedly reimagined by different generations as a Renaissance prince, an Enlightenment monarch, a romantic hero, a Victorian gentleman, a modern psychological study. Each generation would find new meanings in the ancient story, but they would all be building on the foundation that Malory had established. Malory's achievement was to take the sprawling, contradictory tradition of Arthurian romance and distill it into a single powerful narrative that captured the essential spirit of the legend. His Arthur is neither the historical war leader glimpsed in early chronicles, nor the remote king of French romance, but something new, a tragic hero whose greatness is inseparable from his flaws, whose kingdom's perfection contains the seeds of its own destruction.
The search for the historical Arthur. Having traced Arthur's literary evolution from early Welsh tradition through Geoffrey of Monmouth and French romance to Malory's definitive synthesis, we must now turn to the question that has fascinated historians and archaeologists for generations. Was there ever a real Arthur? This question became particularly urgent in the 19th and 20th centuries, as Romantic nationalism led scholars to search for historical foundations for their national legends. Just as German scholars sought the historical basis for the Nibelungenlied, and Scandinavian researchers investigated the historical reality behind their sagas, British historians began applying modern critical methods to the Arthurian tradition. The search for the historical Arthur faces several fundamental challenges. First, we are dealing with a period, the late 5th and early 6th centuries, for which our historical sources are extremely limited. The collapse of Roman administration in Britain created a documentation gap that historians call the Dark Ages, for good reason. Second, the earliest sources that mention Arthur are already separated from any possible historical figure by centuries. The Annals Cambriae that record Arthur's victories at Badon and death at Camlann were compiled in the 10th century, some 400 years after the events they describe. The Annales Cambriae, attributed to Nennius, dates from the 9th century and is equally distant from the events it claims to record. These early sources are not attempting to write history in the modern sense. They are creating origin myths, preserving oral traditions, and making political points about their own time. They cannot be read as straightforward historical documents. Despite these challenges, several generations of scholars have attempted to reconstruct the historical context that might have given rise to the Arthurian legend. Their work has revealed a fascinating picture of post-Roman Britain that, while it cannot prove Arthur's existence, helps us understand why such a figure might have been remembered. The key historical reality is the British resistance to Saxon expansion in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Archaeological evidence confirms that while Saxon settlement spread rapidly across eastern Britain after the Roman withdrawal, this expansion was halted for several decades in the late 5th century. Something or someone organized effective British resistance. The most important piece of contemporary evidence comes from Gildas, whose De Excidio Britanniae was written around 540, within the living memory of the events he describes. Gildas mentions a British victory at Mons Badonicus, Mount Badon, that resulted in a temporary halt to Saxon expansion.
He attributes this victory to Ambrosius Aurelianus, whom he describes as perhaps the last of the Romans, and a leader who organized British resistance after the Saxon rebellion. Gildas does not mention Arthur, which has led some scholars to argue that Arthur never existed, but others point out that Gildas was writing a moral sermon, not a comprehensive history, and he may have omitted figures who didn't serve his rhetorical purpose. Moreover, Gildas's account of Ambrosius Aurelianus matches in some respects the later accounts of Arthur. Both are Romano-British leaders who organize resistance to Saxon expansion and achieve a crucial victory. This has led some historians to suggest that Arthur and Ambrosius may be the same person, or that Arthur was Ambrosius's successor as war leader. The title Dux Bellorum, war leader, that Nennius gives to Arthur may represent a real military office, perhaps a continuation of the Roman role of Comes Britanniarum, Count of the Britons. Archaeological evidence provides some support for this theory. Excavations at sites across western Britain have revealed evidence of fortification and reoccupation in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Hillforts that had been abandoned since the Iron Age were refortified with new defenses. Major sites like Tintagel in Cornwall and Cadbury Castle in Somerset show evidence of high-status occupation during this period. Cadbury Castle has attracted particular attention because local tradition identified it as Arthur's Camelot, and archaeological excavations in the 1960s and 1970s revealed extensive fortifications dating to the Arthurian period. The site was clearly the stronghold of a powerful ruler who commanded considerable resources and manpower. But while these archaeological discoveries prove that powerful British leaders existed in the Arthurian period, they cannot prove that any of them was named Arthur. The identification of archaeological sites with Arthurian legend remains speculative, based more on later tradition than on contemporary evidence. Linguistic evidence provides another approach to the historical Arthur question. The name Arthur itself is puzzling. It appears to derive from the Roman name Artorius, but this is unusual because most British names from this period are Celtic rather than Roman. Some scholars have suggested that Arthur might be a title rather than a personal name, possibly related to the Welsh word Arth, or bear. Alternatively, the name might preserve the memory of a Romano-British family that maintained Roman naming practices after the end of Roman rule. There was indeed a Roman general named Lucius Artorius Costus, who served in Britain in the 2nd century, and some scholars have speculated that the Arthur legend might preserve distorted memories of this historical figure. The place name evidence is extensive but problematic. Sites across Britain claim associations with Arthur, from Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh to Arthur's Stone in Wales. But most of these associations appear to be medieval or later, reflecting the popularity of Arthurian legend rather than genuine historical memory. The Battle of Badon, which both Gildas and later sources present as the crucial British victory, has been located at various sites across southern Britain. Bath, Badbury Rings in Dorset, and Liddington Castle in Wiltshire have all been proposed as candidates. The multiplicity of proposed locations suggests that the actual site has been forgotten, though this does not necessarily mean the battle never took place. Hollywood has also played a crucial role in shaping modern perceptions of Arthur. Films from Camelot, 1967, to Excalibur, 1981, to King Arthur, 2004, have each presented their own vision of the legend, often revealing more about contemporary concerns than about medieval ideals. The repeated return to Arthurian themes in popular culture suggests that the legend continues to speak to fundamental human concerns about leadership, idealism, and the possibility of creating a just society. Perhaps the most significant modern development in Arthurian studies has been the recognition that the legend belongs not just to Britain, but to the wider world. French, German, Italian, Spanish, and other European traditions have their own versions of Arthurian stories, often quite different from the English tradition. Moreover, the legend has been adopted and adapted by cultures far from its European origins, from Japanese manga to American superhero comics. This globalization of Arthur reflects the legend's essential universality. The themes it explores, the tension between idealism and reality, the corruption of power, the fragility of human achievement, the hope for redemption and renewal, are not limited to any particular culture or historical period. Arthur has become a truly archetypal figure, a lens through which different cultures can examine their own values and aspirations. At the same time, modern scholarship has brought new rigor to the study of Arthurian literature and history. Medieval scholars have traced the complex evolution of the legend with unprecedented precision, while archaeologists have provided new insights into the historical period that gave birth to the Arthurian tradition. This scholarly work has not diminished the power of the legend, but instead revealed its extraordinary complexity and sophistication. The tension between scholarly skepticism and popular belief in Arthur remains unresolved. Academic historians generally doubt that a historical Arthur ever existed, while popular culture continues to treat him as a real historical figure. This tension itself is revealing. It shows how myths function differently from history, serving psychological and spiritual needs that mere facts cannot fulfill. The enduring power of the Arthur legend lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its ability to embody timeless human concerns. Arthur represents the eternal human hope for perfect leadership, for a society based on justice rather than power, for the triumph of good over evil. The Round Table represents the dream of true democracy, where worth matters more than birth. The Grail quest represents the search for spiritual meaning in a material world. But the legend also acknowledges the limitations of these aspirations. Arthur's kingdom falls, the Round Table is broken, and the Grail remains elusive for most seekers. This tragic dimension is crucial to the legend's enduring appeal. It recognizes that human idealism is always imperfect, always threatened by human weakness, yet always worth pursuing. The belief in Arthur's return, the idea that he is not dead but sleeping, waiting to return in Britain's hour of greatest need, represents perhaps the most profound aspect of the legend. It expresses the hope that no matter how completely our ideals seem to be defeated, they can be renewed and revived.
Arthur's promised return is a metaphor for the resilience of human hope itself. This hope has been invoked repeatedly throughout British history. During the darkest days of World War II, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill explicitly compared the nation's struggle to Arthur's battles against the Saxon invaders. The parallel was not historically accurate. The Saxons were not Nazis, and Arthur may never have existed, but it was psychologically powerful, connecting contemporary struggle with the deepest narratives of national identity. Today, in an age of global challenges and environmental crisis, Arthur continues to be reimagined as a figure who might provide guidance for our contemporary dilemmas. Climate change activists invoke the Round Table as a model for international cooperation, while political reformers cite Camelot as an example of enlightened governance. These modern applications of Arthurian symbolism might seem naive or simplistic, but they reflect the legend's continued vitality. Arthur endures not because he was a historical figure who lived 1,500 years ago, but because he represents ideals that remain relevant to human aspiration. The question, "Who was the real Arthur?" may ultimately be the wrong question. The real Arthur is not a historical figure to be recovered through archaeological investigation, but a continuing creation of human imagination. He is the Arthur of each generation that rediscovers and reinterprets the legend, finding in it new meanings relevant to contemporary concerns. Arthur is both the war leader who may have fought the Saxons, the king of medieval romance, Tennyson's Victorian gentleman, White's psychological study, and every subsequent reinterpretation. He is all of these and none of them, a figure who exists not in history, but in the realm of story, where different kinds of truth can be expressed. Conclusion: the once and future king. We have journeyed far from the mist-shrouded battlefields of post-Roman Britain to the global cultural phenomenon that Arthur has become. Along the way, we have seen how a possible historical figure, a war leader who may have achieved temporary success against Saxon invasion, was transformed through centuries of storytelling into one of the most enduring legends in world literature. The transformation was neither simple nor straightforward. Each generation of storytellers reshaped Arthur according to their own needs and values. The Welsh made him a mythological hero who could journey to the otherworld and command supernatural forces. Geoffrey of Monmouth made him a historical king whose empire rivaled Rome. The French Romance writers made him the center of an idealized court where love and honor were the highest values. Malory made him a tragic figure whose nobility could not prevent his kingdom's destruction. Each of these transformations was so complete that it seemed to create Arthur anew. Yet beneath all these changes, certain essential elements persisted. The idea of a golden age when justice prevailed, the fellowship of the Round Table that transcended traditional hierarchies, the tragic recognition that even the highest human achievements are fragile and temporary, and the hope that what has been lost can be recovered.
This process of continuous transformation reveals something profound about the nature of myth itself. Myths are not simply stories from the past. but living narratives that each generation must recreate for itself. They survive not because they are historically accurate, but because they address concerns that transcend any particular historical moment. The Arthur legend addresses some of the deepest questions of human existence. What does it mean to be a good leader? How should power be exercised? What is the relationship between individual desire and social responsibility? How do we maintain hope in the face of inevitable failure? These questions have no final answers, which is why each generation must approach them anew. The historical question, whether Arthur really existed, remains unresolved and may ultimately be unresolvable. The evidence is fragmentary and ambiguous, filtered through centuries of legendary development. But perhaps this uncertainty itself is significant. A historical Arthur would be bounded by the facts of his time and place. The legendary Arthur is free to embody whatever qualities each generation most needs and admires. The Arthur we have traced in this journey is thus both historical and mythical, both real and imaginary. He exists in the archaeological remains of post-Roman Britain and in the pages of medieval romance, in the desperate resistance of Celtic peoples, and in the dreams of perfect kingship, in scholarly footnotes and popular imagination. What emerges most clearly from our investigation is that Arthur's significance lies not in what he was, but in what he has become, a figure of such archetypal power that he can serve as a mirror for human aspiration across cultures and centuries. He embodies the eternal hope for perfect leadership, just society, and meaningful existence, while simultaneously acknowledging the tragic gap between aspiration and achievement. The Round Table remains one of the most powerful political metaphors ever created, representing the possibility of a society based on merit rather than birth, justice rather than power, cooperation rather than domination. That this ideal society ultimately fails does not diminish its power as an aspiration. Indeed, the tragic dimension of the legend makes it more rather than less compelling because it acknowledges the real difficulties of human cooperation while insisting that the attempt is worthwhile. Similarly, the Grail quest continues to resonate as a metaphor for spiritual seeking, representing the search for meaning and transcendence that characterizes human existence at its highest level. The fact that the Grail remains elusive for most seekers does not invalidate the quest, but makes it a true reflection of the human condition, where spiritual fulfillment is always partial and provisional. Arthur's promised return, the belief that he is not dead but sleeping, waiting to return in the hour of greatest need, may be the most psychologically profound element of the entire legend. It expresses the hope that no defeat is final, that lost ideals can be recovered, that human aspiration is ultimately indestructible. This hope has been tested repeatedly throughout history, and it has repeatedly proven its power to inspire renewal and resistance. In our own time, when traditional authorities are questioned and established institutions are under strain, the Arthurian ideal of earned rather than inherited leadership seems particularly relevant.
The Round Table's vision of a meritocracy where the best and bravest could sit as equals offers an alternative to both autocracy and mob rule. Arthur's combination of strength and justice provides a model for leadership that is both effective and ethical. At the same time, the legend's tragic dimension serves as a warning against utopianism. Arthur's kingdom falls not because it is attacked by superior forces, but because it is corrupted from within by the very human weaknesses it was designed to transcend. The lesson is not that idealism is futile, but that it requires constant vigilance and renewal. The globalization of the Arthur legend in our interconnected world reflects its fundamental universality. The specific cultural context that gave birth to the legend, post-Roman Britain facing Saxon invasion, is now largely forgotten, but the human concerns it addresses are as relevant as ever. Questions of leadership, justice, loyalty, and the proper use of power are not limited to any particular culture or historical period.
This universality explains why Arthur continues to be reimagined by each generation, and why these reimaginings often reveal more about contemporary concerns than about medieval ideals. The Arthur of climate change activism, the Arthur of democratic reform, the Arthur of gender equality, all of these are legitimate heirs to the tradition, because they use the symbolic power of the legend to address the challenges of their own time. The Arthur legend thus represents one of humanity's most successful attempts to create a story powerful enough to survive the vicissitudes of history. It has outlasted the Roman Empire that may have shaped its origins, the medieval civilization that gave it its classic form, and the modern industrial society that rediscovered it. It seems likely to survive whatever transformations the future may bring. This survival is not accidental, but reflects the legend's deep understanding of human nature and human needs. Arthur represents not what we are, but what we might become. Not our actual achievements, but our highest aspirations. He embodies the eternal human hope that we can do better, be better, create societies worthy of our highest ideals. The tragedy built into the legend, the inevitable fall of Camelot, prevents this hope from becoming mere wishful thinking. Arthur's kingdom fails because it is composed of fallible human beings who cannot fully transcend their limitations. But the failure is not final because the hope it represented continues to inspire new attempts at creating justice and meaning. In the end, the question, "Who was Arthur?" reveals itself to be less important than the questions, "What does Arthur represent?" and "Why do we continue to need him?" The answers to these questions change with each generation, which is why the legend remains vital and continues to speak to new audiences. Arthur is the once and future king not because he once ruled Britain and will rule it again, but because each generation discovers anew the ideals he represents and finds in them the inspiration to continue the eternal human quest for justice, meaning, and transcendence. In this sense, Arthur's return is not a future event, but a present reality. He returns whenever and wherever human beings commit themselves to the values of the Round Table, whenever they undertake their own quest for the Grail, whenever they refuse to accept that defeat is final, or that aspiration is futile. The legend of Arthur thus stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements in the realm of story.
a narrative so rich and resonant that it can bear the weight of 15 centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation, while retaining its essential power to inspire and transform. Whether Arthur ever lived is ultimately less important than the fact that his legend continues to live, continues to evolve, and continues to call us toward our better selves. In our contemporary world, faced with challenges that require unprecedented cooperation and wisdom, we may need Arthur more than ever, not as a historical figure or magical solution, but as a symbol of the possibility that human beings can transcend their limitations and create something worthy of their highest aspirations. The Round Table awaits, the Grail remains to be found, and the once and future king sleeps still, ready to return whenever we prove ourselves worthy of his awakening.